Okay, good afternoon and welcome everybody to the meeting of the Health and Safety Committee of the Cincinnati Board of Education. I call this meeting to order, and we'll start with a roll call. Mr. Messer.
Present.
And myself. So we definitely have a quorum. Do we have our governmental liaisons online?
Yeah, Eric just sent me a message, and I'm going to send him an invite to join.
Okay, good.
And same with George.
Awesome.
Eric and George, did you accept your invite? You should be ready to go. There we go. They're both here.
Great. Welcome, Mr. Glover and Mr. Kearney. And we're looking forward to hearing about what's going on in Columbus.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I got for some reason I don't know. I got put in the guest file. So we provided a report, and Phyllis was kind enough to distribute it for us. And basically, it highlights a few bills. The number one bill, of course, is the budget bill. And there are a few things in the budget bill. George, would you take the lead on that portion? Madam Chair,
Yes.
Can George hear me? Do you know?
Eric, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Oh, okay, great. If you would talk about the budget, please.
Eric, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Last week, the Ohio House did pass House Bill 110, which did include the proposed school funding provision that was previously in House Bill 1. That is, of course, the former proposal. It increases the amount of school funding for the state of Ohio, K-12, to approximately $1.8 billion. Part of the funding fix came from what we call the wraparound services that were provided by the White administration, the amount of about $500 million. The bill, however, does face questions in the Ohio Senate as it begins its review this week. I would anticipate the Senate would probably consider and enact their version of the state budget late May or early June, allowing about 2 or 3 weeks for the House and Senate then to reconcile their differences on the final compromise bill and have an act in place as mandated by the state constitution by June 30th. The Senate continues to say that they have concerns about the overall cost of the bill. As passed, the House version would allow it to be enacted. It would be allowed to be funded over 3 bienniums or 6 years. During the current year, all school districts would be held harmless. I'll stop now and see if you have any questions.
Any members, do you have questions? Yes, Ms. Bowers.
Thank you for that update. I did read that also that there's some concern that you said the school district will be left harmless, but I think there was a concern that their school district is going to lose money as to why there might be some pushback on this.
Hello?
Hello, did you hear me? Hello, did you hear my response?
George, did you hear Member Bauer's question?
No, I'm sorry, I did not.
She asked if there would be any pushback.
For the concern that some districts would lose money, even though I heard you say the districts will be will not be harmed. But I thought that there was some concern as to why there might be pushback because there will be districts that will lose money and it might not go through. Is that a possibility?
The last thing I saw that there were very, very few number of districts, perhaps 10, that actually had a loss in funding. I think the concept was, or the hope was, that they would have them all hold harmless. I think the bigger objection will come within the Republican Party and the Ohio Senate as they try to navigate this bill and truly get a cost factor on it that they're comfortable with. But it's clear to me right now that they feel it's perhaps not fully priced out, if you will, and that it's going to cost more than what the House has said. So they're going to continue to dig deep and get a better handle on what they feel is the full cost of this bill. We continue to be fortunate, as I think we all know, to have a good member from Hamilton County, State Senator Bill Blessing, involved in this issue, both on the Senate Primary and Secondary Education Committee, as well as the Senate Finance Committee. His door remains open to us, and I'm sure he'll continue to work with us as much as he can. I would pose one question to the school district, though, or to Jen. Have you been able to receive any hard numbers at this point to show you what the figures might be for CPS based on the House version?
Jen.
So George, Jen is not in this meeting.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
That's okay.
I think that's the type of feedback that'll be helpful to us, because I suspect we'll be asked that very question in the Senate as the bill goes through that process. So any feedback we could receive on what the House version will do for CPS would be helpful to us.
Can we get that question to Jen for response to George? Okay, thank you.
Chair Bowers, I hope that answers at least questions as well as I could.
It does. That was good feedback. I'm glad you gave me the number of schools that, even though it's not a good thing for any school to lose any funding in this process, but that made it more clear for me. Thank you.
I will say that one section of the House passed version of the budget that seems to be well received in the House Senate is the whole idea of having charter schools being paid directly by the state instead of being paid through the individual public school districts.
Except for transportation, correct?
That, Eric, do you have any information on that?
No, I think she's right. The chair is right. The chair is right.
Two other quick areas. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please continue.
Two other areas that could probably be reviewed in the Senate consideration of the state budget will be the report cards. Again, they're looking for some sort of compromise on best to define report cards in Ohio, and perhaps another overhaul or remake of the School Distress Commission. I know it doesn't impact CPS, but it does impact 3 school districts in Ohio, and they're still trying to figure out what to do with that, whether or not they even want to keep that in place going forward. So those 2 issues I think will be also addressed in the state budget as well.
Any other questions? Okay.
So I think there are just a couple more things, if I could, Madam Chair.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would say that we've been working with Krista. We usually have a meeting every other Friday. We couldn't have one this past Friday because our schedules conflicted, but I think with respect to working with Krista, we're going to issue some letters to on some of the bills that are coming up. Some of those have little asterisks in your report. For instance, HB 200 to revise the state report card and school accountability. The anti-bullying bill, which I think, 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 I I remember 2 years ago, I think you, Madam Chair, were very involved with this particular issue. And I think also Board Member Messer was also on the anti-bullying issue. And then I think that obviously with the budget bill and with Jen's input, we should, we should weigh in as a school district. And so Krista and Dan, I imagine we'll work with them to craft a response on behalf of the district. Is anybody else getting crazy feedback, or is it just me? Yeah, it's just me. Okay, maybe it's my aluminum hat isn't on, or something like that. Next time I'll just come in because that's probably easier for me, just in general.
Madam Chair,
Yes, Mr. Glover.
one more bill we should bring to your attention that I know is keenly looked at by CPS and a number of other school districts around the state of Ohio. It's a bill that's been introduced by one of our area state representatives in Hamilton County, Tom Brinkman. That bill is House Bill 117, and it will allow school transfers. I know it's something that CPS strongly opposes, as do other school districts. That bill has only been sponsored by himself and nobody else. It's had one hearing in the House Public Education Committee. I'm told that it may not have much of a future, but we certainly want to keep a close eye on it. Again, that's House Bill 117, sponsored by State Representative Tom Brinkman. Eric, did you want to pick up any of the details in terms of what the bill actually would do?
You're on mute, Eric.
Well, I know Dan Hoyne is very strongly opposed to it, so we're certainly keeping a very close eye on that bill.
Yeah, so if you were in an adjacent school district, you could move to a different school district. And so I think there are a lot of people across the state who don't like the bill, as George noted.
It would be in Indian Hill or whatever.
Ms. Bates, I'm sorry, you have to repeat that. I fixed the audio.
Oh, okay. So if this passes, and an adjacent district is Marymount. If the people, if the people in Madison Place wanted to move to Marymount, they could.
Yes.
So we would lose their taxes and their enrollment.
I'm not sure. The enrollment part, I feel comfortable in saying yes to. The taxes part, I'm not sure how that part would go, but that would make sense, right?
That's what happens now when there's a petition that's successful.
Yeah.
And that's why go ahead. Mr. Glover.
I personally don't see it having many legs, but
I know in talking to Representative Brinkman, he suggested maybe we put a date certain on it for only 6 months. I think that's a little suspicious because you can always remove that date certain at any point going forward. That could become a very slippery slope. So our thought is just simply to stop the bill in its entirety right now.
Yeah. Committee, do you, what are your thoughts? I mean, we have already discussed this, and the administration certainly is opposed to it, so I will take the direction the committee agrees with the administration and our governmental liaisons.
Sure.
Thank you.
I think those are the highlights at this point in time, unless there are any other questions.
Anybody have any questions about what's going on?
I do.
Yes, Ms. Bowers.
House Bill 73, can you tell us where we are in that process regarding third grade reading guarantee and pension? And with COVID.
Yeah, okay, hold on one second. Let me pull up the latest. Oh boy, okay. Okay, right now that was sponsored by Representative Manning, and she's the chairperson of that committee, and Erica Crowley, who is a Democrat. And right now it's in the primary and secondary House committee. It has had it's had one hearing, and that was just sponsored testimony, and that was just done last week. Last April 20th was when it was introduced last Tuesday, and so that's the only movement on that particular bill right now.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? If not, I thank you very much for your report.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, committee.
Thank you very much.
All right, our next is on our work plan for review, and that is Ms. Fonte, Assistant Superintendent Fonte, with child abuse prevention.
So while Rob is pulling it up for us, I just want to remind everyone that it is mandated that we take child abuse training every year. So we successfully completed that back in August and September, where all of our employees participate in child abuse training over our Safe Schools platform. But I do want to share an update with what we have done around child abuse. This was featured in the Inquirer today, so very timely, a positive article. So next slide, please. If you look at our timeline here, back in March of 2020, so almost a year ago, we were really concerned about the safety net that our students lost with them being out of school during our mandated closure time. So working with Children's Hospital and also Hamilton County JFS, particularly joining forces through the Mayerson Center at Children's Hospital, we put together a collaborative team that included teachers, community members, and those agencies that I just mentioned. On the next slide, thank you, Rob. Kind of small, but you can see that we began back in March, and in April, we started really in-depth child abuse training for what teachers could look for in a virtual setting, because it's very different from being in person than it is being virtual. That training was developed and pushed out to teachers in May, and we began to do a lot of SEL videos that you'll see on the next slide in just a moment. And then in September, did a joint press release to the community, as well as past September presentations at the State House to acknowledge this work. Next slide, please. So if on this slide you can see that the SEL group created CPS De-Stress, which was on our CPS YouTube channel, and those videos were jointly created by CPS and Jobs and Family Services, along with Joining Forces for Children, and released in that forum. We also created that deep dive mandatory training, which I mentioned. And then we created a series of PSA announcements called Safe and Sound at Home. Next slide, please. So what does that look like in terms of overall success? We know that we had over 6,470 views on YouTube for our CPS channel, where we had families engaged with the SEL work, really taking a look at how to support their learners at home. We had 50 teachers do that deep dive into child abuse training. As I mentioned before, we had already the mandated reporter training. And then we spent a lot of time at Food Hub, so thank you to Sarah Trimble Oliver and her folks, who allowed us to pass out flyers in that venue and really advertising the PSA information about what families could do if they were worried about loved ones or what help they could seek out if they themselves were stressed during that time. So as we know, COVID has been incredibly challenging, not only because of the physical manifestations of illness, but also because of the mental health that people experience. So since this time, in partnership with McKinsey and also with Children's Hospital, we've developed a series of what teachers can look for in terms of trauma in children, and that has been pushed out to our teachers across the district. 300 teachers have taken the full 4 modules. Others have taken various components of that, and actually it is now being promoted in 2 other school districts in our city. Next slide, please. So we would like to acknowledge the partnerships that we developed in order to do this work. Again, Children's Joining Forces, which is led by Bob Shapiro out of the Mayerson Center at Children's, preparing obviously CPS, and then Johnson Family. So that's a brief update about child abuse in our district and its prevention. Can I answer any questions or?
Yes,
Thanks,
thank
Ms.
you.
Bowers.
Thank you, Monty, for that report. And the only question I do have is, now that we're back into May again, is it time for another training now, especially with us being back 5 days a week? As with many mental health agencies, we anticipate an uptick in a lot of referrals for services. And I anticipate that we're going to see some of those behaviors in the schools and how we need to be. And when we get to discipline, all those things, we can probably think about how that looks with just the experience our students have had with abuse, in addition to community violence, which was another article that I read about today, how that number has upticked and how some of that spills over into school areas, starts in schools and spills over into the so I was wondering if the school-wide approach, I know we talked about teachers being trained on this, but a school-wide approach about wrapping around our students who have experienced this and maybe looking at that also. Has that been thought about?
Mm-hmm. So we are really excited that in the fall, back when we come back to school in August, our full staff professional development day is going to be on social emotional learning, specifically geared to trauma. So all 6,000 of our employees will be engaged in that work in some form or fashion on that day, digging deep into how we can wrap support around our students.
Very good. Thank you.
Mr. Messer.
Yeah, I apologize in advance for my voice, but I think getting to Member Bauer's point, we expected that there would be an uptick. So have we in fact seen that uptick as a result of what we think to be the pandemic since we returned to full-time instruction?
Yeah, so I asked that very same question. JFS has not released numbers to us. So we don't have confirmation of that, whether that's actually occurring. We do know that when our students even returned in the hybrid model, that safety net was in place, at least partially. Now that they're back full 5 days a week, that safety net is secure. So yes, we don't have it.
Yes, and I read the article today, and the article, and apparently JFS gave some numbers to the NCLAR that referrals were down 18%, which is kind of alarming because that doesn't mean that abuse is down 18%. Right. It means that the abuse is going unnoticed and unsupported. Mm-hmm. So are there additional, is there more to the safety net to try to catch the children that were missed during the hybrid and the totally remote time?
So I think it's a combination. Joining forces, and the Mayor, as you may know, the Mayerson Center through Children's Hospital works with significantly abused children and providing support to them and to their future care providers through therapy and networking. And they have been reporting a very steady decline through this whole time. And what they've talked with us a lot about when we were creating the PSAs and also the module development for parents and the SEL supports for parents was that it really takes a network. So working with churches, working with the rec centers, working with after school care providers, working with our school system and all of those who are face forward with students, it takes all of us to be in that space together. And so I think that's why this initiative was so important, is because it wasn't just CPS saying that we're in this space, but to your point, it needs to continue to develop and continue to grow those partnerships across. Because that's how that safety net is more tightly woven. It just isn't one body or one. We are hoping that through Summer Scholars, we can continue to be able to support families through that process.
And then the same thing.
Go ahead, Ms. Bowers.
I just want to highlight the importance that you just said of it's more than just a school. And understanding that the families are struggling. So that's a whole way of looking at it as opposed to looking at it as a person who committed crime, as opposed to people are struggling.
Very much.
And I like that viewpoint that you said it requires all of us. So thank you for making that comment.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, and transportation review, which typically is handled in finance, as Mr. Messer and I well know, but a couple of things have led to this topic at health and safety. One is that we've been, as board members, I know all of us have been getting feedback from our constituents about the unsafe conditions. Parents, the bus schedules in numerous cases have been off schedule, which, you know, at the beginning of a school year, which we had, is understandable, but the lack of communication has been alarming, and parents are very upset about that. There's no way to track the buses. Our bus companies they don't seem to be able, if they can track their buses, they're not giving that communication back to their call centers. Apparently, well, there's been a request to extend the contracts, but the contracts, from a board perspective, we don't see accountability for this in the contracts. So I know that the finance committee is not inclined to support extension of the contracts without accountability and without a plan for accountability, because this kind of these issues of lack of communication and, you know, lack of bus drivers who even if they're subs are not following the routes appropriately have been going on for, I was talking to Eve Bolton today, we think about 7 years. And it's about time that we have our vendors, pay the piper and take care of our families the way we expect them to. It's total reflection on CPS, even though it's our vendors. So that's why we asked for the report in health and safety today.
And ask Sarah to start off by talking about communication and also being able to track the buses.
Sure. So Mr. Johnson is prepared to give an update on the progress that we have made in the transportation services over the past couple of years. I am confident that we have made some improvements to where we were with services and communication as of 2-3 years ago. We're not where we want to be yet, and we're going to show you some of that data. What is encouraging is that this year, Mr. Johnson has been applying our quality improvement methods that we learned from children, not only to our own operations, but to our vendors' operations as well. And they're part of that quality improvement work on their own operations. So not only are we improving the work that we do here, we are extending that, and they're having the opportunity to improve their own operations using our methods and tools. And so Mr. Johnson will show you some of the progress that has been made so far, as well as wrapping up with areas for, that we still have for opportunity for improvement.
All right. Well, thank you, Chairwoman Bates, for allowing me to speak with you guys today and fellow board members. As Trimble Oliver said, I want to give you a brief overview of our transportation services. Just go to the next slide, Raj. In full transparency, when I came on board roughly 2 years ago, board tasked me with three things: operational efficiencies, customer experience, as well as health and safety of our students. We embody a mantra called CPS Access, where we focus on accepting the responsibility for ourselves, our actions, as a network of vendors. We want to communicate effectively. We want to collaborate with others, extending transportation to the schools and to our various partners within the district and communities. We want to embrace diversity, and then we also want to focus on safety first as being that core initiative within our mantra, while we focus on also showing respect. I think over the years, our services have been very disrespectful, not only to our students, but our overall community and what we have been able to provide. Next slide, please. So in full transparency, we issue out about 1,300 trips a day. 1,300. Just put a frame of reference out there for everybody to understand. And that we do have our 6 major vendors that we operate with, including Metro as one of those. Our entire network is committed to providing the level of service that this district deserves. As you pointed out earlier, 7 years in the making of frustrating services to date, right? And what I hope to show you today is the progress that we have made in a short period of time since I've been here. Next slide, please. So in full transparency, we have demand versus supply. And from the federal, the state level, to our own board policies and strategic plan, which is influenced heavily by our stakeholders, of our parents and our families, and our community members, to our own operational plans developed by district leadership, we create a trifecta that centers around health and safety. And of course, that's having the systems in place, the standard operating procedures in place, as well as how we effectively manage our vendors, and then ultimately our customer experience. If we have a breakdown in any of those areas, our system is not operating where it should be. Next slide, please. So to talk about a little bit of quality service, on-time performance, we have put systems in place to ensure that we can monitor the quality of our service. To note, first time this year and ever of history of CPS, we can track our buses to the tune of 95% of all vehicles when they go on the road. We know where they're at. This has not been the case in years past of CPS. This allows us to have the systems in place for my team to monitor the vehicles through on-screen application that we have. Also allows the schools to have arrival boards that they could track when the buses are going to be arriving to their schools, as well as the application that we put in the hands of our parents, a free application, My Stop application, that parents can use to track where the bus at in relation to arriving to their stop, in relation to arriving to the school. This is done by putting that system in place. We go to the next slide. So over the course of on-time performance is what we really kind of focus on, right? We feel if we get the kids to school on time, that tackles probably 99.9% of our issues when it comes to health and safety, right? To date, to give you a frame of reference for this school year, we have executed just under 58,000 trips, routes, right? 58,000 routes. Of that, we had assigned, but only 66% of those have been running because of COVID, school closures, route closures, etc., for contract tracing. Overall, of those 58,000 routes that we had roughly 95.6% of those reporting GPS data when they were running. In addition to that, 77% of them was arriving on time within 5 minutes of their scheduled arrival time. 77%. Another 10.4% was arriving within 6 to 10 minutes of that time. So we can say with confidence that close to just below 90% of our routes are arriving to schools within that 10-minute window of operating time. In addition to that, we know that there was a total of 3,200 trips that were either did not have GPS data to it, or they were arriving to school plus 16 minutes late. And those are areas that we identify as areas that we still need to improve on. Next slide, please. So the other piece of it, as you guys pointed out very clearly, is communication, effective communication. We worked very tirelessly when I first came on board was to create a centralized point of contact for parents, families, and our stakeholders. And that was accomplished through our 363 RIDE number, which is 7433. This allows our families, our stakeholders to have one point of contact to get into contact with transportation. The benefit of this system is one system that allows us to collect the data. When we collect the data, we know how many calls we're receiving, how many calls are answered, what is the nature of those calls, so we can better tune our services towards those areas. So, for example, if we get a lot of calls for route information, that tells us that the way that we're communicating route information to our parents needs to improve, or we need to look at alternative ways to communicate that information to those parents. These are the matrix and the data that we did not have before that we are now putting to use to make the system even better. Next slide. In true fashion with the calls, as you guys pointed out, we get inundated with a lot of calls. I'd like to point out that on March 31st, when we returned, we had just shy of 8,000 calls come into our system. 8,000 calls. There was no way in the world that we would be able to handle 8,000 calls. And so did we have dismal numbers during those first couple of weeks? We did. We had numbers as low as 38, 39% answer rates. We recognize those opportunities that we need to better shift our staff according to those peak hours. What we also want to note is that on average, we are receiving about 1,500 calls daily with roughly about 43% answer rate since March 31st when we returned. A lot of this has to do with staffing. If we don't have the adequate bodies to actually answer the calls, then therefore calls go unanswered. And also sometimes the degree and nature of those calls will require more time. 5-10 minute long calls will tie up that person, which could probably handle 2, 3, 4 more calls during that same time frame. Next slide. So safety is our core. And we want to ensure that we have procedures in place to handle some of the key things surrounding the safety of our children while they're in transportation. And so what you see here is just a slide that shows some of our process maps for our key areas, such as when we have a missing student, when we have students that receive that drop-off, and this is primarily to students with disabilities and our kindergartners, our most vulnerable students that we transport. And then also our process for dealing with student conduct on the vehicles and everything, because we know, even though this is a unusual year, we still have those behavioral issues on the bus, such as compliance to our COVID procedures that make sure that everyone is safe on that vehicle to and from school. Next slide. So as Mrs. Strobel-Oliver stated earlier, we are always reflective about our services and what we can do to be better. And to highlight some things from our operational team, we know we need to increase our efficiencies. So lower our demand because we do have a driver shortage. Usually in operations, when you have service disruptions, it's because of one of two things, a deficiency of resources or a deficiency of knowledge. What we're seeing and experiencing right now is a deficiency in our resource, which is our drivers. We have the vehicles, we have a great plan, but we don't have the people to execute that plan, which is the qualified CDL driver behind the wheel. The other area is curb-to-curb service for our IEP, and make sure that we're maintaining the compliance of services that's needed for those students. So we can make sure that those students don't go unnoticed, unheard, and they're getting proper support to get to and from school. The other area is looking at doing a deep dive bus stop audit. We recognize that a large amount of our calls that we get from parents and our stakeholders is regarding the nature of that stop. Is it safe? It's not safe. I want to move the stop to here because I have a predator at this location, or it's no lighting at this stop right here. I submitted a grant to Safe School the Routes with ODOT, and we're hoping that we will get awarded that grant here in June. And part of that work there is to increase the education to our students regarding how they're accessing our bus stops, how they're accessing our schools, and hopefully put together a wraparound project that can be implemented with fidelity throughout the district. The other area that we want to focus on is our customer experience team, and we recognize that when we do have high call volumes, that we need to make sure that we have the staff appropriate to those areas of those peak times. As we alluded to some of the contract extensions and the need for a contract extension, is to specifically address some of these areas so they can have appropriate number of staff in those call centers so we can address those needs of our stakeholders when they call. One such things that we're looking for is to make sure that we have bilingual staff in there to address our ESL families and communities. The other area that we want to say is directly working with our vendors and looking at on-time performance. Increasingly making sure that they know at the end of the day, we're judging them by getting from point A to point B in that time frame that we have planned. The other area is making sure that they know the drop-off procedures, the correct stops. We've had a couple of incidents where students have been dropped off at the wrong stop, and when we look at a root cause analysis, it's because that wasn't the regular driver. That was a sub-driver. In some cases, that was actually a sub-vendor covering for another vendor who didn't have staffing. So when we have those operational breakdowns, we have to make sure that we're communicating effectively internally so we don't have those breakdowns with students. The other big thing is driver recruitment and retention, and that's where we need to really focus on recruiting the right driver. We want drivers who actually care about our students. And part of our QI project is building stronger relationships with the schools, and so highlighting those drivers that do care and building off of that core commitment there. And so this provides a high-level overview of where we're at, and when it comes to health and safety for transportation service, and open to answer any questions that you may have.
Questions? Go ahead, Ron.
Well, I'll start by saying there's a lot of jobs here that I would never want myself if I got one. Absolutely no way I would want that job. And, you know, I think for context, I mean, we're a district of 37,000 kids, and there's 1,300 routes per day. That's not a small number. So I just want to acknowledge the complexity, and I will say, just from when I joined the board, there has been significant improvement. So I think we have to make sure that's on record, because I just remember that first year, and I heard like from previous years. So I think we've come a long way. So to me, it's not an issue of if something's going to happen, there's always going to be something that happens. But it's how we respond. And, you know, frankly, I had a handful that kind of came to my lap because I was added to this group just so I could keep an eye on these parents who felt like they didn't know where to turn. And so what I got from, you know, the people that I connected was they were happy with the outcome, which is good. So a couple of questions that I have. So first of all, 1,500 calls per day and up to 8,000 calls per day. It's almost like, you know, the 8,000, like it's almost like one out of every two families that would be using the bus would be making a call. So what are they calling about when it's that 8,000?
So it could be something as simple as we don't want transportation services right now. I didn't get my route card, or to, hey, I want my stop changed, or I want to be picked up at this address for a DBA address. It's a wide spectrum of calls, and some of them is like, oh, well, the bus didn't come today. We used to get calls like that, and we have to say, well, this is your group assignment day. So a lot of times we are the informants of the entire district plan, and so sometimes we're answering questions that are not pertaining to transportation, but are byproducts of transportation. And so we take it as a one-stop shop. We don't like to have parents transferred or anything like that. And so if it is a call that is not within our realm of expertise, we take the ownership of it to make sure that we get them in the hands of the right appropriate people.
And what I would add is we asked the very same question when we saw those numbers the first 2 days of return to 5 a day.
Yeah.
And so we tasked that team with coming back with an analysis of all of the call categories so that we can address them and figure out how can we not have that many calls next time.
Yeah. Yeah. So and then I don't know if there's a filter, like if this is truly a transportation, press one. If it's another one of these, I don't know, but it just seems like when you think 8,000, just seems like a lot. So trying to dial that back, is there another way to engage with all the other technology we have, specifically with our transportation families, that, is there a way to communicate to them via text or, I'm just thinking about other systems because it just seems like a lot. I do think the zones, if we get to that point, is going to mitigate a whole lot of, complexity to our system. We look at kind of dividing the district into the zones. But, I think, is there a role of a parent advisory board? And, or some way to engage a core group of families to help support the work that you're doing? One thing that, as I was watching some of these Facebook comments, somebody said, oh, well, we haven't used the bus system for 3 years because XYZ happened. Well, that was kind of before maybe some of our changes were made. And so are there ways to look at some of the people who have opted out that, they every time they have to go drive their kid, they're mad because they can't use that bus system? Is there a way for us to track the people who maybe once used and aren't using to kind of re-engage some of them? Because I still see some are still a little salty. And so they're adding things from years past. And I think if there's a way we could find out who the ones who have left us are, that maybe we could learn something from them. And then I think this other question about drivers to me is so interesting, that you hire a vendor, you shouldn't have to now do their work to do their recruitment. But obviously for, the business we're in as kids and trying to make sure that the right people are at the wheel, is there a way to broaden the message here? Because we know that transportation's an issue, families depend on this, and there is a shortage. And, is there a way to connect that to somebody who may be a newly retired grandpa who says, you know what, that might be a fun thing to do for my early retirement? Are there things that we could do out of the box to fill the pipeline of people who would be caring, et cetera? Because at least 3 of the issues that I was aware of were because there was a shortage of a driver, there was a driver that didn't show up, or one that was filling in that didn't know what they were doing, including the one that was at Hyde Park where they dropped the kids off. That was not the regular driver, as I understood. Right. So getting ahead of that theme, is there something we could do as a campaign through the community to raise awareness that might identify that next group of drivers who would care for our kids in the years to come?
This is in no way an excuse, because there were driver shortages before COVID, but COVID did exacerbate the issue because we were in session, then we were out of session, and then we were back in session, and so it really did make the problem worse this year. So I think that's a fantastic idea, and we can discuss how.
And as far as the parent engagement, one of the caveats to our VIA system is we're building out survey assist. So at the back end of our calls, parents will have the luxury to leave us a survey response. And so that's something that we're hoping to get rolled out here before next year. We're in the development phase right now with Cincinnati Bell to build out that system there. And we are developing customer experience cards that the drivers can hand out, the vendors can have, that if there is a conflict, that they could just dial that number and it dials right into that survey and leave us that feedback. And so we want to make sure that survey is in the 4 dialects of our district, English, Spanish, Nepali, and French, so we could touch the masses across the board.
Great. Thank you.
I want to suggest to your point, Board Member Metzer, that we pull together a parent group, much like we did with technology, which has turned out to be beneficial in terms of getting parent feedback.
Yes.
And Tom Shaw took the lead on that.
I did write that down.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I have a question. Why are we having all the calls answered by a person? I mean, any other customer service I use for anything, the response, if there's not one person to answer, is for efficient service, go to our website and you can, list your issue. So if there's a school bus stop change or, where, whatever, that doesn't need a customer service rep. Whereas my child requires a customer service rep. So why haven't we gotten to that point yet?
Yeah, that's a great suggestion for our next phase of the call center.
Are they our employees or are they employees of the vendor?
Combination of both. And this year we did things differently. We brought them all in-house so we could have a little bit more better oversight of the conversations that are being had with our stakeholders.
I think that's a great idea to have some questions answered. I will say, board member Bates, the real thought was to have a live person be able to answer the phone, especially when you're talking about a child.
Mhm.
But I can understand there's some things that could go here or go there. But yeah. So we'll definitely explore it. Thank you.
Ms. Lawrence, you want?
Hey, Mr. Lawrence. I'm good. I would just like to commend you from what you started, and I think we kind of worked in this together. But I think I got on the board in 2019 when you first came, and the progress that I've seen has been dramatic in a positive column. I would like to identify that having more bilingual representation for our students would be excellent. And as a person of a past, a deceased, retired school bus driver who drove the school bus from our healthy schools for 30 years, things have drastically changed in bus services when the district owned their buses. And I know that that's a fiscal responsibility that we don't want to take on. But at that time, it looked different, and there was more accountability. And I know that that's hard to do now. But I have a question: how much involvement do we really have with the hiring, especially with the issue with the drivers? Do we have a big input with the hiring of drivers, since that's a contractual position?
So we are allowed to put the framework as far as the requirements to be able to hire in a person. Ultimately, no one starts driving for us until I vet them out and give them the stamp of approval. And that's us doing a thorough review of their driving history, the trainings, that make sure they have all the trainings in place that we want to see them have. And we dictate the professional development for our drivers. All right, we are required to have a minimum of 4 hours of training a year, but that's a minimum of 4 hours of training. I look at how we train our peers, our teachers, and everything to interact with our students. There should be some form of comparable training given to our transportation personnel as well. And this is where we're looking at our partner sites, such as Children's Home, to step in and provide us some specialized training for transporting that demographic of students, to contracting out and doing some communication training that I did back in 2019. I believe you came to one of those sessions there. And quite honestly, this year we couldn't do it because of COVID. But that is something that I do plan on building on for years to come, is us controlling the nature of professional development around our drivers. Because we could teach them how to operate a vehicle, and most of our trainings are geared towards this operating a vehicle. So little is given towards student management, interacting with students and everything. And that's where I think we as a district need to set that parameter and actually hold them accountable for that information.
Is there any mid-year ideas about doing a check-in, how we do with teachers' professional development throughout the year?
Yes.
Are you doing this with some of our drivers and assistants on the bus?
Yes. So one of the great things about some of the systems that we have in place is a new accident incident system. And it's going to replace our current bus conduct system that we use that doesn't directly tie to power schools. This will allow us to see the matrix regarding this bus having X number of incidents. Why are you having so many incidents on that bus, and pulling that out to give a driver a actual scorecard. And so then we can rank our drivers accordingly. And of course, those bottom 10%, those are the 10% that we actually work with, do remedial trainings with, to boost up those skill sets so we can feel comfortable with them being behind the wheel of our students.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Messer?
I'm kind of now having like some thoughts about the whole driver thing. One of the memorable moments over the past couple of years for me was when we brought in our crossing guards and thanked them for keeping our kids safe. And have we done anything ever like that for bus drivers?
So Bus Driver Appreciation Day is May 8th this year, or May 3rd, May 8th or May 3rd. So it is coming up. Of course, I lean very heavily on our vendors to actually do things to recognize our drivers. Because at the end of the day, really, we're talking about a quarter of 80% of those drivers that's really doing what they need to do, and 20% of them that are in question and limbo, right? And so highlighting those good drivers is something that we have started doing through our QI process of recognizing drivers and actually informing the schools, informing our stakeholders about the good work that they do. We have drivers that have been behind the wheel for our students for 20 plus years and are diligently day after day transporting our students and everything. And that's our core group. And that's the group that we want to build off of and everything while we identify new ways to recruit and retain new drivers into the system. One of the things that we're encouraging our vendors to do is start a referral program with that core group, because we feel like if it's coming from that core group of drivers that we know are dependable, that really care about our students, they are more apt to bring in people that are like-minded and will provide them that additional support to stay on board year after year.
Yeah, so I think there might be an opportunity, even for the board, as we thank those crossing guards, to do something to recognize them, to raise the profile. I mean, they're literally driving our kids around, and they have their lives, at their hands. And part of engaging somebody is making them connected to the greater good and understanding the value they bring in, that type of thing. So, maybe it's something that we could think about. But let's say somebody's listening to this, or one of us runs across somebody. My reference is like where I grew up. He'd get up, our bus driver would milk his cows. He'd take his kids to school. He'd do the middle milking, pick us up from school, and then do the evening milking. It was this in-between job. What does this look like for an average worker? What does that compensation look like? How is their work structured?
Mm-hmm. And right now, we are literally competing against the government with the stimulus package. And so the stimulus package is, quite honestly, more money than they will make operating in a vehicle for us. And so it's easier for them to just say, you know what, I'm not going to come into work today. Or, you know what, I'm done with this job.
But is it an hourly that we pay them? And and what is this average hours that somebody would make today?
So on average, our average route is approximately about 6.25 hours a day, split shift. And so it takes a unique schedule, a unique person that wants that, early morning work and then early afternoon work, and then you're done. You have time in between the day. The way we are placing demands on our system is it's now going to more of a 7-hour day, 7.25-hour day with midday transport, such as for our preschool disability programs, that now becomes a wraparound service and everything. And of course, with our athletics, provide that support and supplemental support to our dedicated contracts in the back half of the day as well. So there is opportunity out there. And if anyone's out there hearing this message, if they need a job and they can pass a background check, we will teach them, train them how to operate a vehicle, and most importantly, how to interact with our students.
So I think as we've done, I've seen a lot of the recruiting for teachers, which has been wonderful. I thought that was a really good campaign, everybody. Maybe there's something similar that can be shared just like that, because it's another demographic, and I think there's an audience that may not know that this is an opportunity. So thanks for that background.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else on this topic? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's helpful, and we can pass this report along to the full board. Okay, our next agenda item is school resource officers.
Sure, good afternoon. So you'll recall our student group Speak Up, Speak Out. And that group of students made a demand of our superintendent that we strengthen our relations with Cincinnati Police. In addition to that, there soon after came a group, Young Activist Coalition, who demanded that we remove school resource officers from our schools. And so we reached out to Cohere, and Nia is here to talk to us about what we learned. We decided to pull another group of students together from across our district, as well as a group of parents separate from the parents of those initial students. And Nia is here today to share the findings of those two conversations.
Thank you. All right, Nia, you're on.
Sounds good. Thank you.
I'll hear you.
You cannot hear me?
Nope. No.
Hold on, we're checking. She was earlier.
Want to try again?
Yeah?
Yes.
Oh, there you go.
What might be helpful, Rob, as I'm doing this portion, if you would mute the boardroom just so I don't get too much feedback, that would be super helpful. So I will go ahead and share my screen. If I can here.
Are you looking?
Can you guys see my screen okay?
Make it bigger?
Present mode.
Yeah, we can see your cover, okay.
Can you all see everything okay on your end?
Yeah, you can see your screen you're sharing.
Okay.
There it is.
Okay, great. Let me know if any issues arise. I'm sorry. I wish I could have come in person. But as Ms. Murphy mentioned, we've been working with CPS on a plethora of projects, including this one. And before we get started in this presentation, I just want to acknowledge that, this is an incredibly complex topic, and I think it would be unfair for us at Cohere to even say we have this perfect representative sample of how students and parents are feeling around police-student relations and police-community relations in general. So there's a lot going on in our country, in our state, in our city, and we did the best we could with what we had to engage parents and students around a thoughtful and meaningful conversation when it came to school resource officers. So just to give you all a background for those of you who don't know, Cohere is a community engagement and insights organization. And the whole premise of our work is believing that living an issue every day makes you an expert. So as I said before, the group that we engage isn't this perfect representative sample, but it helps us get to those really complex insights and really interesting experiences that both students and parents have, in this case with school resource officers. So in addition to the Speak Up, Speak Out group that Ms. Murphy mentioned, along with the Parent Advisory Board that we also facilitate with Ms. Murphy, we hosted 2 separate focus group style conversations. One was with about 20 students from junior high and high school, and then there were about 12 parents in a separate conversation. They represented 12 schools, and there were 5 resource officers present. So those school resource officers didn't necessarily speak, but they did get an opportunity to answer questions at the end and ask a couple questions of both parents and students. So it was a really thoughtful conversation. I'm excited to share with you all some of the findings that we had. Before we jump into these 3 key themes and major takeaways, there's really this underlying 2 underlying themes that I want to acknowledge. One is that overall, most students and parents who were asked directly about the removal of SROs in schools weren't necessarily advocating for that. More than anything, they wanted to see relationships strengthened. They wanted to see de-escalation practices get more innovative. They wanted to understand and develop relationships with school resource officers. But actively, the group that we engaged weren't necessarily actively advocating for the removal of SROs from school. And it's important to, going back quickly, it's important to look, as you're looking at these demographics, we specifically organized parents and students who had negative experiences with SROs as well. So you can keep that in mind as I'm talking through this presentation. The other overarching theme that we won't get into as much today, but I do encourage, I do encourage Cincinnati Public Schools to explore is the idea of, especially with students, compartmentalizing their relationships with beat officers and what they're seeing outside of school and their relationships with SROs. There are many students who have really positive relationships with SROs, but then turned around and cited really negative interactions with a police officer that they ran into at a traffic stop or at the mall. And they kind of separated those things. So for the sake of today's conversation, we're going to be focusing mostly on their relationships with SROs, but I do think exploring what does it look like when a student is hanging out in the summer and they come in contact with a police officer who's not a school resource officer, and how does that feel for them? So with that being said, the major themes were really around increasing engagement, being transparent around the roles of SROs, and then practicing empathy. And I would say the transparency piece was the biggest theme that came from parents, and the practicing empathy piece was the biggest piece that came from students. So engagement is not something new to school resource officers. Obviously, they're out in the community. Even in one of our conversations, a parent said, "Oh, I recognize you from being at Camp Joy." That immediately puts me and my child at ease. So school resource officers are obviously doing a lot to engage with students, but there's opportunities for more, especially when it comes to junior high and freshman students. A lot of the younger students on our call and in our focus group said that they didn't know their SRO, didn't really know what they were about, felt kind of out of the loop. Certainly going to school virtually for a period of time aided in that a little bit, but there were other students who were maybe sophomores or juniors who felt the same way. So there's definitely an opportunity for SROs to get outside of their comfort zone and maybe test out going to different places. So if they've gone to Camp Joy for the past few years, maybe they try a different way and engage with youth in the community so they can get to know other individuals in the school setting. Some other opportunities that came up or ideas that came up specifically from students were around developing opportunities for students to really tell their story and their unique perspective to SROs. So in the Speak Up, Speak Out group, one of the ideas that they had was to just host a training, if you will, where students actually provide the training on how they would prefer to be talked to by SROs, some of their concerns that they have, and just have an open dialogue. So I would definitely encourage CPS to think more about that as well. There's a student from Withrow, she's a freshman, who talked about introducing officers more at the school. The second theme was around transparency. And as I mentioned, this one was very specific to parents feeling like they didn't really understand the entire role of school resource officers. So it's not that they were necessarily against them, but they were trying to figure out what is the difference between when an SRO disciplines my child and when an administrator disciplines my child. As well as the potential legal consequences of that, right? If an SRO is getting involved, there's sometimes it opens the door to legal consequences. And that's something that I think a lot of parents are fearful of and feel like maybe when an SRO gets involved, it escalates things because of that. So educating students and parents around the consequences based off of their specific actions, I think would be really helpful. The other piece that came up was really educating parents and students around the backgrounds that SROs have. During the parent conversation, SROs shared how difficult it can be to become a school resource officer, how much they really want to work with kids, their social work backgrounds, the specific student training that they receive. And a lot of these parents didn't know those things, and there were a lot of head nods and kind of appreciation for hearing that. So being creative about ways to amplify, these school resource officers truly are uniquely qualified to be in the buildings, to work with students, could be something that's helpful in engaging and elevating trust in the community. This is a student from Hughes that talks about, the importance of having security in the school. So he really didn't feel like there was a need for SROs to be removed, and actually kind of highlighted that sometimes SRO can be helpful in calming students down. The final piece and large theme was around empathy and understanding. And as I mentioned before, this really came from the students. They really wanted to see more innovative and positive ways of de-escalation. They felt at times if they were getting in trouble or there was a scuffle at school, the SRO might approach them in a pretty aggressive manner, which actually escalated things instead of calming things down. They also cited some confusion around the protocol. So, and this actually came up when we spoke to the SRO separately around when is it a school administrator's job to get involved and when is it the role of the SRO to get involved. And being clear about that, again, I think will be helpful for both students and parents. And another piece, and this is a really sensitive one, but I think one that's important to acknowledge, obviously there's an overwhelming amount of feedback around police officers in general right now. And I think with that comes a natural defensiveness and a feeling that perhaps criticism is an attack on a police officer's integrity. And certainly that was not the case in these conversations, but police officers, and in particular, we're talking about school resource officers, have to be open to the idea that there are things that need to be improved and that not every criticism is meant to attack them, but is truly a way of students and parents asking for help and wanting to see things change and get better and see more positive interactions in the school setting. So I think there's a role for the SROs to play in terms of accepting responsibility for some of the deterioration in relationships that has happened over the years when it comes to their relationships with students. So here's a student who talks about negative experience that they had at Withrow. And the unique thing about, as I mentioned, most of these students who even had negative experiences, they understood why they got in trouble. They maybe even felt like they liked their SRO, but at the same time, they felt in the moment that they were scared. And this particular student talked about how the police officer kept saying that they were going to jail if they couldn't get their mother there in time. And it was a really scary situation that maybe escalated a little bit too far for her emotionally. So what were some things that the SRO could have done to calm that down? Because ultimately, she didn't go to jail, her mother did show up on time, and they were able to problem solve for it. So maybe some of that language wasn't necessary, but it shook her up a little bit. So here's some actionable ideas. I won't read them all just for the sake of time. I'm happy to answer any questions, but as we talk to parents and students, I would definitely say that educating parents and students on the role of SROs, their unique qualifications, and what it is they're specifically there to do, what's within their jurisdiction, is really important. I think with both parents and students who did have negative experiences, they were very confused as to why their student did have to go to jail or why their student did have to get arrested, or maybe why the SRO had to get called in the first place. So being really clear about the protocol, and it's probably written somewhere, but making it even more clear for parents and students could eliminate some of the negative feelings that they have when they do come in contact with an SRO for a behavioral issue. Another big thing to think about, of course, as I mentioned before, with the Speak Up, Speak Out students is facilitating opportunities for students to really talk to their SROs, not just in this focus group format, but just having open conversations with them about what they're seeing and feeling in the community when it comes to police-community relationships, as well as what they would like to see more of in schools with school resource officers. So I think there's a lot of different opportunities here. The final one that I would suggest that I believe we're moving forward on is actually conversation with school principals and SROs directly, so they can begin to get a little bit more clear internally around when is the right time to bring a SRO into an issue and when is something that they maybe should problem solve for themselves. So I will stop there. This was one of the quotes from a parent that I thought was really thoughtful, and I think both parents and students felt the same way, that it was just really important for SROs to think about ways that they can de-escalate situations in a more creative way. So she said using the same methods over and over again because people in the police force are too afraid to become more creative. How it could just have a huge impact to change how police officers are interacting with students. So I will stop there. I know I kind of walked through that pretty quickly, and I'm happy to share that presentation with you all, but I'm happy to answer any questions. And I know, of course, Ms. Murphy was at all of these conversations as well, and I'm sure may have additional thoughts.
Thank you. And also, we don't have a ton of time left, so I'm going to move us through quickly because I also, the young activists asked to present, and we barely have time for ourselves. And I asked them to present a written report, which they did. They gave it to us on Friday, and I forwarded it to the board members and Mr. Hoying, and asked Mr. Hoying at the same time is working with the city to get data on arrests. And that's another issue, is that we're just not getting the data from the city to help our program, to help aid our program on a regular basis. There's not that constant communication. So, Mr. Hoying, can you report on some of the questions that we had around the data that you requested and that the young activists provided to us?
Well, I'm glad to answer any questions. In terms of, we certainly have reviewed everything that they submitted, and we've reached out because the ACLU of Ohio was also involved in sending us some information last week. I made contact with them, and we are setting up a meeting with them to understand. It wasn't entirely clear from some of their interested in learning that and having a longer conversation. I'm glad to answer any questions. In general, I think that their report conflates discipline with the involvement of SROs, which we intentionally view and the city intentionally views as very different. In fact, our MOU with the city that provides SROs specifically says that SROs are not to be involved in school discipline. So a lot of that is conflated in the report that they gave us. And so we want an opportunity to explain that to the ACLU as well. So we've already reached out to them and are planning to meet.
Great. And just kind of, this was pointed out to me, it's the attorney works for the ACLU Foundation, which is separate from the organization. It's a little different. Anyway,
I think she's an intern or something. I don't know.
She said she was an attorney and credit, and then that she was with the Greater ACLU Foundation, which funds this kind of activity, which just kind of make that, because I was very concerned that the ACLU was getting involved without really contacting our own legal counsel.
Yeah. Well, I had a positive conversation with her on Friday, and I expect to have a positive conversation. Have a chance to.
And to kind of bridge this, and you all have this article now, and these are some, the article that came out in the Enquirer last week about the number of juveniles that have been assaulted and killed, and shortly after that, we lost a student. And I can't stop thinking about that. And here we are discussing getting rid of protection when our kids need protection and support so badly, but there doesn't really seem to be a connection between the SROs and the training they receive in working with children and students and the beat cops who are working in the community working with our youth. And I think that this, would be an excellent opportunity to work with the city in bridging that, because there would be a lot to learn from both sides. From, they're all dealing with the same kids. We're dealing, and then there are other children from the charter schools and that, but for the most part, we educate most of the kids in Cincinnati. And these are the ones getting assaulted and killed. And, we had a 14-year-old who's doing, and I don't know if he was ours or not because they haven't named him, who was doing contract killings. You know, there was a 14-year-old up in Wilmington that wasn't ours who committed. I mean, it's just out of control. And the leaders have to do something about it. And what I wanted to ask the committee is that if we can make the recommendation, and I'll bring it up during either probably assignments tonight, that we recommend that our board in our next meeting with the city council committee make this a priority topic and to schedule a meeting with either council or the appropriate committee to discuss this as soon as possible, to pull together our resources, Cincinnati Rec, City of Cincinnati, the police force, our SROs, because this is a crisis. I mean, it's just, you know, and this is the tip of the iceberg. We're going to have summer, we're going to have the fall, and we're going to exceed, if we're on this track, you know, more kids getting killed and assaulted than we've ever seen in our city's history. And we just can't act like we're in a snow globe. And, you know, if anything, the SROs, I believe, can provide good leadership to the force and how to work with our students. And that's what I'm hearing. We can be better about working with them, but they, you know, this has to be a united front. So that's the recommendation I'm going to ask the committee, that we move this to the full board and request this to be the top agenda item with our city council committee. Is that something that you would support?
Yeah, I think they're already started from that article too with some of the things, but I would
Right.
to be part of that, yeah.
Yeah, I fully support that. I mean, and I think my other question is, I mean, we've been hearing a whole lot from the Young Activist Coalition. And, you know, they are a stakeholder, and we have hundreds of other stakeholders. And, you know, I think we have to put this in context. I don't know if those members of the Young Activist Coalition are fearful of being stabbed in their neighborhoods where they live. I don't know if they feel in danger when they're in school. I don't know that. But I think, you know, what I hear from Cohere is a much broader view that seems to be a little bit more representative of the families and the children that we serve. And somehow, you know, they're students and they're obviously, their opinions count with Young Actors Coalition, but somehow I feel like some adults in the system need to sit down and say, look, we've heard you, but this is a much bigger issue. I mean, read the paper. Some of you aren't in these neighborhoods. Some of you aren't in these schools. Please, they need to listen to their other students in the other schools. And at this point, I don't think that has necessarily been connected. And I think that's the group that was blocking the doors as we came in tonight, that to me looked like a fire hazard. God forbid something happened to this building and people had to exit. What would that equate to? So we've kind of got to, you know, they're causing a bigger crisis in that they're putting other people in danger. I shouldn't have to go to a side door to enter a school board meeting because, you know, somebody wants their point to be heard, which we've heard many times. But how do we stitch this together to the broader conversation, the one that Chair Bates is talking about? I mean, this is a serious community-wide issue that goes well beyond, you know, the SROs and kind of what we have been getting as kind of little bits and pieces. So I commend the work of Cohere. There may be a need for Cohere to help the broader city think through these challenges, because, you know, this article today hopefully now makes everybody at least aware that this is a call to action. And I appreciate the work that's been done to bring this report to us today to help us understand more and more about what exists in our schools today. But I think we have to tie that to the greater community conversation.
And just to wrap up, because I know we're running out of time. Thank you, Nia, for the presentation. Just some key points. I would agree that there can be a misunderstanding on when an administrator pulls a resource officer in versus the security. And I don't know if internally we need to look at that more closely to making sure that our school has that level of security, because I know sometimes they may or may not. And then the resource officer is used as security, so that can be conflictual. There are some campuses I know that have present SROs all day long. And then there are other schools that the SRO may be responsible and the kids don't even know who that is, because unless there's an issue, the SRO is called. So then there's also the community concern. There are some a campus or some campuses that may have a lot of students hanging out before school, and the role of the SROs and community people are saying, these kids are not in school, they're hanging out at this gas station, what is the district doing? What is the police doing? So it becomes some community issues too. So there's a lot of things that we need to unravel and kind of fix. And just in regards to the young activists, there has been community conversations that I've heard and been a part of as far as this listening, to encourage young activists to be more involved with other people. Even with Iris Rowley, who's an advocate of the community, has been giving them direction. Sometimes the feedback is taken, sometimes they're not. So there are other conversations and encouragement that are coming, other people in the community, to try to have a more level playing field. So it's just taken or not. So it's not that community people and other people are not trying to help redirect and trying to help strengthen at a broader scope. There are. It's just sometimes it's not received well from this particular group. So.
Are there any comments, administration? Okay, so I would accept that. I would ask the committee to accept the presentation as presented by Cohere, and also will receive a follow-up. I know that administration received the data on Friday, so to come to us with, a clear understanding of its accuracy, what it means, how it breaks down today was just not possible. So we get that, but that's something that this committee, I believe, would request that we have a follow-up on the data and clarification, and make sure we know as a baseline what we're dealing with, and hopefully point out where the improvements need to be made, and also, as was expressed, the need to have maybe some written procedures around transitioning from principal to security to SROs, that escalation. Yes.
Can you give me a quick review of what we're going to do with this? I don't know if we're really going to do it.
I have it here. It's the last agenda item. I'm going to pass it out, ask committee members to do homework and give feedback. How's that? By email.
Is it in regards to health and safety, Melanie? I guess I was kind of confused on why we were doing it.
It's according to the strategic plan. So, I would say any feedback, really, I think it's confusing to say, only give.
No, I didn't know why we were doing it. Health and safety. I'm sorry. I guess I'm not clear on what we were doing with this. I mean, reviewing it, yes, but is it for just health and safety to review, or is all committees?
I believe all committees are reviewing.
Okay, all right, thank you.
I would hope so.
Thank you.
So, we are done. Thank you, everyone. Are we not meeting here?
Yeah, we are, but I want to get.